Hello, Wellness Big Sisters and Misters, and welcome back to the Wellness Big Sister podcast. We're going to be finishing up our spring cleaning series finally. So, episode one, part one of the spring cleaning series was all about detoxing our body, learning about our lymphatic system, and free ways that we can help to detoxify our body and spring clean our body. Part two, which was the last episode, was all about sort of detoxing our brain and our glymphatic system, which is a relatively new system that was discovered, but all about how we can help our brain health from sort of that like science-backed and detoxification standpoint. And then part three, which I really wanted to link into part two, but I realized it was just too much information, is also on brain health, but it's more of that sort of like motivation, emotional side of things, hope, happiness, addiction, all of that. So, we'll be talking about our dopamine system, which is in charge of so many things in regards to how we feel. So, I wanted this episode and this final sort of spring cleaning for our bodies, for our brains, for our minds, to go over more of that emotional side of things, that emotional health, and the neuromodulator involved with a lot of the times when we feel motivated, when we feel hopeful, possibly addiction, when we feel sad or down about something. So we'll dive deep into that dopamine system today. So we'll, of course, first start off with the sort of micro sciencey perspective, and then we'll go more into sort of how we can help and how we can sort of train our dopamine system to be optimized for spring cleaning, right? So, what is dopamine? Dopamine's a neuromodulator and it's in charge of so many different things: motivation, drive, feeling hopeful, mood. It's also in charge of movement quality, which we won't quite get into too much today, but if as a physical therapist, like and anyone in healthcare knows, patients with Parkinson's disease have trouble with this sort of dopamine system. So it's in charge of movement quality. It's also involved when we're wanting to like reach a goal, or it's also involved in depression and addiction. Postpartum depression is what I'm thinking of too, and just even like post-travel blues, right? So it can be in charge of the highs and then some of the lows as well. So again, I said it's a neuromodulator, meaning it has effects over a lot of different areas of our body, not just like one specific neuron. So what happens is we have sort of two ways that it can sort of approach and command our body, right? In regards to movement, which again, we won't dive into too much, but then also in regards to sort of like our baseline levels of dopamine and our baseline levels of like how motivated we feel for something. So it can be released again one to one neuron, or it can be released like volumetrically. So it can be released locally, which is a very small distance, or we can just dump all the dopamine into the system and then have it work on a much larger scale, right? So in general, we all have this sort of baseline level of dopamine. So we all exist on a spectrum, and it's largely determined by genetics, of course, but some people just run a little bit more like hopeful, motivated, optimistic, and they might have just a higher level of that baseline dopamine. And then some people might be a little bit more mellowed out and just might live a little bit more like realistic, right? And that's totally okay. But again, those baseline levels of dopamine reflect that, right? So in general, if our dopamine is high, we will be feeling more motivated. If our dopamine levels are lower, we will be feeling less motivated. But what really matters is the change in our dopamine levels from that baseline, right? So let's say we have a spike in our dopamine levels because of some instance, and we'll get into this a little bit later on too with specific examples, but we have a spike in our dopamine levels. Then all of a sudden we have another event that spikes it again. That delta will be a little bit smaller, right? So if we're going from baseline plus 10 points, and then we have another sort of spike, and I'm just giving an arbitrary number for this, but baseline level of dopamine is at 0. Then we have a spike that goes up to about 10 points, 10, points of dopamine or whatever. Then we have another spike. We see a friend that we really, haven't seen in a while, plus 3 points. But that delta between 13 and 10, right, from that initial spike of dopamine to that next spike of dopamine, that delta between the two is a lot less compared to that 0 to 10. So we might be experiencing increased motivation and just like sensation and feelings from that initial sort of spike in dopamine, whatever that was. Maybe we saw one friend that we hadn't seen in a while, and then all of a sudden that friend, like another friend, another roommate from college or whatever, you see both of them back to back. It just so happens that that initial spike had a larger delta between baseline and that 10 points compared to that second friend finally coming around the corner that you saw, right? So it matters about the delta. The other thing to note is that you'll have an initial spike, but then you'll have a proportional decrease below baseline after. So this comes with sort of reaching a goal, postpartum depression, right? Like you have this massive experience, this massively like you know sometimes glorious experience in regards to like reaching your personal best in a race, followed by a little bit of a decrease. And so it'll eventually rise back up to baseline, but that proportional spike and that subsequent decrease helps to maintain those healthy levels of dopamine. So it's not that we always want to keep rising and rising and rising and rising our dopamine levels, right? That gets into more of the addiction sort of framework, right? But what we want is that healthy balance between the two and having that sort of just variations throughout the day. That way we might experience some motivation and less motivation, but again, that's the way that we help to keep that whole system a little bit happier, right? So I'll go through some of the examples, but the important part is we all have a baseline level of dopamine, right? Existing in our bodies. The second important part, we have peaks and we have valleys, and those are necessary, right? We don't always want to be on a high, or else we'll always need to keep raising that threshold to experience that high, right? So, and then the other thing is that peak will have a proportionately lower peak after that, or a lower valley after that too. So in my first example, we're planning a vacation, right? So we have this baseline level of dopamine in our systems. We plan a vacation, and as we start to plan, we start to get more and more excited. So there's that initial spike. Then after we stop planning, let's say we just go, make dinner or whatever, we'll have a subsequent sort of lowering. But that initial spike isn't going to be very much. We're just planning, right? So we're planning, and then that subsequent lowering, and then we're back up to baseline. But when we're on that vacation, we might have a significant dopamine spike. So rather than that planning phase, maybe plus 5 points, when we're on vacation, we might have plus 10, right? But then we'll have that subsequent lowering back below baseline, below that point. So that's sort of example one on how we can expect those post-vacation blues or those post-race blues or whatever it is. It's like we have this high for reaching a goal, but we might feel a little bit more down on ourselves after. And again, that's just a normal physiological response. So it's nice to know these kinds of things, because it's like, wait, just because I've reached a goal, or just because I've reached a personal best or gone on this vacation, why am I feeling sad after this or less motivated? Well, it's because your body is sort of adjusting and adapting, and it's a totally normal response, right? So this is, in a healthy system, this really is the epitome of just like riding the waves, right? So that's example one. Example two, we get more into sort of how it stacks and how the change in those dopamine levels lessen over time, right? Or the experience you feel from a certain activity or event might lessen over time, because the delta between that height and dopamine levels changes. So you're at a baseline level. You're running a race that you've trained super duper hard for. You're on like mile 12, let's say. You see that you got a personal best, right? Like you just absolutely crushed mile 12. And that initial dopamine spike, right? It goes up, whatever, 10 points. And again, these numbers are arbitrary. Sometimes it can double your baseline levels of dopamine. Sometimes it can go 50% more, 100% more. I'm just giving a point system just to have sort of an idea. So you see mile 12. Oh my gosh, I have absolutely crushed that last mile, right? So plus 10 points for your dopamine system, right? And raising those levels. Then on mile 13, you realize you just hit another personal best. So a few minutes after that, you have another spike. But again, that might be, so from baseline plus 10 for that initial one, then you're already elevated. So you're going up, to 13, but between 13 and 10, that spike's a lot less. And so knowing that you got the personal best on mile 13 might not, it'll hit a little bit differently compared to that first personal best from baseline to that 12th mile, right? So does that make sense, right? If I'm experiencing something for the first time, just like that friend rounding the corner, when my baseline levels of dopamine are lower or at their baseline level, I'll sense that experience as being more enjoyable, more hopeful, more motivated compared to the subsequent experience after that might be even better. But because my dopamine levels are already at that heightened level, the change between them is less. And so that delta being less causes my experience to not be as heightened as before, right? So what it really gets into is not necessarily that we're plus 10 or plus 13, but it's that we're going from our baseline level at ground 0 to 10, or our baseline level at that 10 to 13. So we get that 10-point difference or that 3-point difference. And again, we might experience, even though that 13, that 3-point difference is probably a much better sort of goal or target, but that mile 12, when we got the personal best first, that will have a much larger sort of motivated response and happiness response compared to the 13, right? So same thing when we finish a race, right? We might have hit all these personal bests. We might have spiked our dopamine levels. The race finish might not feel as exciting because we haven't necessarily been able to get back down to baseline to make that delta the same, right? Or back down to that baseline delta again. So I hope those sort of examples make a little bit more sense about it is about the peaks and valleys, but it's also about the peaks and valleys relative to where you were at before in regards to your dopamine system. So if you are at baseline, again, I'm saying arbitrary numbers, but 0 plus 10 is going to feel a whole lot better than 10 to 13 because of that sort of delta between the two. So it matters peaks and valleys. It matters your baseline. It matters that we go below baseline after the peak so that we're not constantly having to increase that threshold to feel happier and happier or more motivated and more motivated. And then it also matters the experience that you had before. So if you're just layering on exciting experiences or things that excite you or things that motivate you, that delta between them again, is going to get smaller and smaller because you're already at that high sustained level. So how can we optimize this sort of dopamine system, and what can we do to make sure that we're not constantly needing that higher threshold of dopamine hits is not the right word, but that dopamine release, right? To make sure we're not always like needing to raise that threshold. So the first one is cold exposure, which has actually been shown, again, I absolutely hate these cold showers, but it's been shown to raise your baseline levels of dopamine for a sustained period of time after cold exposure. So multiple hours after cold exposure, you're able to raise those baseline levels of dopamine. So if you're someone that is just experiencing a little bit more mellow or realistic perspective, or just feeling a little just meh, not super motivated, cold exposure might help because that will help raise those dopamine levels for a sustained period of time after. And dopamine can be transient, so minutes to seconds. It is usually a longer acting, like longer release one. So it might take a little bit of time once your dopamine's released for you to actually sense that motivation or sense that excitement. But it can stay a long period of time, just like with cold exposure. So cold is one of them. In regards to sort of goal setting, which again, I know from someone who's sort of working to reach a lot of different goals, whether that be like business, personal, fitness, financial, whatever it is, a lot of the time in our heads, we sense that reward as the goal, right? So unless we reach that reward, we won't be able to elevate or in our heads, we won't be able to get that excited unless we reach that reward, right? So it's all about having the reward be the journey throughout. So if we can sort of trick our brains into thinking it's about the journey, not the destination, right? That's what everyone says. But if we can sort of trick our brains into thinking the journey towards that marathon that we're training for, or the journey towards that financial goal that we're training for, not necessarily the reward, or that journey towards the business we're trying to build, or that fitness goal that we're trying to meet, whatever it is, if we can sort of retrain our brain to be rewarded based on the journey and based on the effort we put into it, that will help increase those levels of dopamine to make us more and more motivated to do that day after day, right? Rather than just saying, oh, I didn't reach my goal again today because we didn't reach that reward that we have in our heads of like, actually running that marathon, or again, whatever financial goal, or getting this many subscribers on YouTube or whatever it might be, right? Whatever that sort of objective measurement that you're trying to reach, if we base it off the journey and about those little efforts that you put in each day, that'll help increase those dopamine levels to make you more and more motivated and be able to return more and more to that motivation over time after time again, rather than getting so down on yourself for not reaching that goal. So it's cold exposure, and then also kind of rewiring our brains to be like, it really is about the journey. It's not about the destination. That way our motivation can come day after day and not just at the end of the race or once we reach that business goal or financial goal or whatever it is. And then the last thing, again, to make that system a little healthier, is I mentioned as we sort of increase those dopamine levels and we keep increasing those dopamine levels, we get this sort of excitement. But if we want to reach that same amount of excitement again, that threshold often raises and raises and raises to where, let's say we really enjoy working out, but then all of a sudden we add music, which we really, really enjoy. And so now we're working out with music and we get this super new high. And then the next time we work out, it's just not the same, right? So then we have to add music and our favorite workout and our best friend, right? Or whatever. And so we're constantly adding these things that we enjoy on top of one another, which consistently raises that threshold. And those are all amazing things, right? But if we want to sort of maintain this healthy level where we're able to be motivated and then we allow those dopamine levels to drop and then return back to baseline, we want to sort of have this random reward schedule, right? So maybe one of your workouts you're silent, and then the next you randomly listen to music, and then the next one you're silent, randomly listen to music, whatever. You kind of have this sort of random pattern of when you're sort of layering all of these things that make you feel more motivated or more excited or happier or in a better mood, right? So I'm using the workout example, but it can also be a reward that you reach in your business, right? So rather than getting a reward after every single time you reach a goal, trying to vary it so that you're not necessarily expecting it. This is why casinos work, social media works, all of these things, because they have these sort of intermittent reward schedules where it does have a little bit of an algorithm to it, but it's the unknown, right? It's like, oh, I might get it. So you're always sort of anticipating, where you'll have more motivation to, pull the slot machine or whatever it is, because you have these random hits of success or hits of dopamine, right? And so the same thing can be applied in a more purposeful way to healthier habits, right? So things like working out, strength training, whatever it is, not layering so many dopamine spiking activities on top of each other. So same with reading your favorite book mixed with your favorite candle being lit, and then a huge environment of serenity, right? That puts you in this sort of motivated state, but maybe having one and then the other, because all of them are really good, but sometimes it just helps to bring that threshold and bring that sort of system back to a normal threshold, so where we'll have the same amount of excitement no matter whatever activity or dopamine hit that we want to add to it, right? That way we're not always constantly having to improve upon each and every sort of threshold for working out, for financial goals. Again, like reading our favorite books, we'll be able to enjoy that, have that pleasure in that activity without needing other causes to increase our dopamine, right? To have that same amount of pleasure. So those are ways that we can sort of improve that system. Now, in regards to sort of a dopamine detox, which I know is sort of a hot topic right now, and a lot of times I feel like it gets a bad rap because it's like we're abstaining from any pleasurable activity, right? Which is not the case. But in my head, I think of a dopamine detox as something where we're checking in on these habits that we have throughout the day that we might be not realizing that we're increasing, that we're needing more time on it, or usually it's more time, or we're needing more enjoyment from, and so we just consistently increase these thresholds, right? So it's things that we need to check in on, like social media. Are we spending so much time on there because we're looking for that next increase in that spike in dopamine, where we see that creative post and we see the fitness workout that we want to do, and then we see all these things, and then it's just like, dopamine hit on dopamine hit on dopamine hit. But then we're not checking in with ourselves and realizing, oh my gosh, I've been scrolling on social media for 2 hours, when previously you'd be able to get that amount of creativity and pleasure and enjoyment from it for 10 to 15 minutes or whatever it is. So coming back, again, all of these things that I'll list as far as things to check in on are amazing things and really fun, creative things and things that I enjoy. But if I'm being really honest with myself, I do have to check in on these things during this spring cleaning time phase to be like, hey, I am spending a lot of time on social media or listening to podcasts on my way to work or whatever it is, where let me just take it back a notch, right? Maybe 2 years ago, I was listening to like 1 or 2 podcasts consistently, and now I'm up to probably like 6 or 7, maybe up to 10, and I feel like I have to get them every single week. And so it's things like that where I'm like, okay, let's dial it back a little, because they're all good. They're all learning or feeling creative or getting inspired or whatever. But it's just a check-in, right? And it's not saying that they're bad, but as far as a dopamine detox goes, just a check-in, right? So check in on your social media habits. Of course, that's going to be number one. And again, number one and number two, podcasts for me are like huge. Number three, music. I feel like honestly, these are all speaking to me. So if you're feeling called out, just know I am too, right? So social media, podcasts, music, right? So same with the working out. If you're working out to your favorite music and then requiring even more of that threshold to be raised, then check in on the music thing. Maybe work out to in silence at some point, or just with a friend or something like that. Reading a book or a certain type of book, snacking, movies, TV shows, online shopping. Again, all of these things can get addictive, right? And so it's like, how can we sort of tune into our body and tune into our system to know when we've gone too far? And then the last thing that I want to talk about, again, this is more of that sort of mental health, emotional health side of things. Part two was more of the brain health, but I wanted us to check in on our emotional health as well, right? And so I've been reading a great book called Untangle Your Emotions, and it's by Jenny Allen. So it's a faith-based book all about our emotions and how they relate to our faith, which I think is an absolutely incredible book. It has some really great science and applicable sort of techniques to use. But it's a way to sort of check in on our body. And there's a book, I have not read it yet, but I believe it's titled like To My Core, that our body does keep the score. And so if you're experiencing things emotionally or letting things go unchecked emotionally, it's going to show up in your body, right? And currently I've been dealing with some headaches that come about once a week, and I know that it is regarding sort of my emotional and mental health, right? And so I'm working on addressing the underlying causes of that to say, hey, there is something that I have been neglecting within my mental health, my emotional health, that is causing some of these physical symptoms to come up. And for me, that's a headache, right? And so what sort of emotions or experiences have we had that are going unchecked, and where might that be showing up in our body? And this is a very, very, very reflective process. So I'm proposing a sort of written emotional health check-in, or a journal session, or honestly a mindfulness session too. So I'm picturing like writing it down, and then also a mindfulness session where you're like, okay, over the last, and this might need to be sort of a consistent effort, but over the last week, where have I been a little bit more angry or upset or frustrated? And have I ignored that? And if so, let me go inwards and give those emotions space, right? Give them time to tell me what they're trying to tell me, and help me to locate them throughout my body. So I've been working a lot on sort of somatic tracking. And again, I'm not a professional on this, but basically sensing the emotion, where it is in your body, and letting it speak for itself, right? And noticing it, giving it the time of day, right? Rather than burying it and pushing it down. Because a lot of the times what happens is we do push them down. And for some for some other time it's necessary, right? We can't always be having these sort of frustrations or outbursts or anything. And so sometimes it is necessary to push them down, but we need to go back and revisit them too, or else we'll just build upon each other, right? So if we let them go unchecked, they will start to show up physically. And that's where these sort of headaches or bloating or something, numbness, tingling might be coming in, and bad dreams, whatever it might be, right? So we need to give them the opportunity to speak. And so I love personifying my emotions like inside out, right? Because I don't know, it's a way to sort of dissociate from them a little bit and like say, okay, I sense you, headache. What are you trying to tell me? Like, what underlying this whole experience are you trying to tell me? And I will give you space. And if it's something for more self control because I feel out of control in a certain scenario or whatever it is, starting to talk to that area in your brain or body, wherever you're sensing it calmly and being like, hey, you're safe. I'm here with you, and speaking truth into it, because a lot of the time these emotions just get blown out of proportion too, right? So it's acknowledging them, it's not judging them. If you're angry, if you're frustrated, letting it speak for itself. And again, sometimes that might be writing, sometimes that might be more of a mindfulness session, but these are truly like so important, which is why this is one of my favorite parts. We're probably ending on one of my favorite parts of the spring cleaning series, is because it is so very important, and it comes up both in our mental health and emotional health and then also physically as well. And so it's sort of full circles this spring cleaning moment. So I challenge you and challenge myself to sort of write them down, experience them, try and do a mindfulness session, and maybe I will like sort of record another podcast or YouTube video or something guiding through this. Again, I'm not a professional, but I've been working on it for myself for the past, probably 6 or so months, but all about sort of untangling my own emotions, untangling like all of the different strings and different links between how I'm feeling. And this is one of the ways that has really helped. And so I feel like it's a great way for spring cleaning and for spring cleaning our mind and our emotional health, in addition to all of the sort of leveling out and cleansing of our dopamine systems as well. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. We will wrap it up there. Done with the spring cleaning series, spring cleaning for our body, our lymphatic system, our brain, our glymphatic system, and for our mental health and our emotional health. The dopamine cleanse, dopamine detox, all about our dopamine system, and then also our emotional health. So I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. I would really appreciate it if you could follow or subscribe or share this episode with someone who you think might benefit from it. Or again, an accountability partner. That way you can check in like, hey, have you done your, emotional check-in? Have you done something to help level out that dopamine system? Have you, just done some of the mindfulness, somatic tracking experiences, whatever it might be? It's always nice to have an accountability partner. And if I need to be that for you, I would love to. So message me and we'll make it sort of a little community of accountability for our emotional health. But again, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Like, subscribe, whatever, it really helps. If you want to see it on YouTube, this will be uploaded. And I'll see you guys again for the next Wellness Big Sister podcast.